many people are with you and are speaking out for you and are working hard to try to change the situation. I can't promise that we will succeed in changing the situation in the near term, but we recognise that this is a long struggle and we will be with you the whole way. Freedom is never totally secured. Freedom is something that we must fight for and defend and protect all the time, because it can easily be lost and reversed. I had a very, very happy time in Hong Kong. I loved it. I didn't generally see any big problems at that time in terms of Hong Kong's freedoms. In one country, two systems, I thought one country, two systems was working generally very well. Of course not perfectly, I'm sure there were some problems, but compared to today it was a free and open city. I started to see towards the end of my time some kind of subtle minor threats to press freedom, some element of self-censorship by some journalists. Hong Kong tobacco tycoon Charles Ho, and he had a lot of business interests in mainland China, and so he started to clearly try to change the paper from being a very outspoken, free-speaking newspaper into something a little bit less critical of Beijing. And that was one of the reasons I left, because I could see changes that I didn't like. By 2017, I was realizing that, first of all, the level of awareness and understanding at that time among British members of Parliament, media, general public, about what was happening in Hong Kong was very shockingly low. Very few people were really following Hong Kong. And secondly, I realized that actually Hong Kong needs an advocacy voice, and that on my own in my spare time, that's not sustainable, that's not enough. So I thought we need an organization. And then the idea crystallized when I was in Indonesia on a visit for work for CSW. And it was a few days before the sentencing of Joshua Wong, Nathan Law and Alex Chow, the first sentence that they faced. And I'd been following their trial and I was thinking about them. And I thought, yeah, we need to start an organization.
As a British man, why Hong Kong? Why do you stand with Hong Kong?
I think several reasons. I mean, first of all, having lived there, because Hong Kong was once my home, it was the place where I started my working life, my career as a journalist, and actually my career as a human rights activist began in Hong Kong. And so I feel a personal responsibility for Hong Kong for that reason. Secondly, I feel as a British person that Britain has a particular responsibility historically and morally to help Hong Kong. And thirdly, I think Hong Kong matters not just because of Hong Kong itself, but actually what it represents. We've seen the dismantling of what was one of Asia's freest and most open cities, and it represents the front line for freedom. That actually is an attack on freedom itself, and that ought to concern all of us who enjoy freedom.
In 2019, what was your feelings seeing the government action to repress the protests and the full-armed police using brutal force in the streets? Have you ever imagined Hong Kong become a battlefield?
I was really shocked by what I saw in 2019, particularly because I know later in the year there were some elements of the protest movement that turned more radical and even in some cases violent. But at the beginning, when the movement started, the protests were entirely peaceful, and throughout the year the protests were overwhelmingly peaceful, and it was really the police who started the violence for no reason. The shocking scenes of indiscriminately beating people, firing tear gas and pepper spray and using other weapons. And one of the most vivid images, I think, for me was, well, one of many, but was when the legislator Ted Hui, who was trying to mediate between the police and the protesters, a police officer actually took off Ted Hui's goggles and pepper sprayed him directly in his face. And to do that in such a targeted and totally disproportionate and unacceptable way, especially against a legislator, was really shocking. Thousands of protesters have been arrested, but not a single police officer was brought to justice for what they did. Really was outrageous.
You believe Hong Kong is one of the most open city in the East. Is it ironic when you see the development after 2019?
Yes, I mean it has gone very rapidly from being one of the most open cities in Asia to now, I think, one of the most repressive cities in Asia. It's a city where every single freedom has been dismantled within just a few months, whether it's freedom to protest, freedom of the press, freedom to contest elections, freedom to have a legislature that at least has some pro-democracy element to it.
You said in medium term you cannot see there will be a big change in Hong Kong in terms of freedom. Have you already seen the worst?
I think we have probably seen the most dramatic part of the worsening of the situation, because the national security law and then the major arrests of almost all leading pro-democracy activists have now happened. But that doesn't mean that it's all over. I think I think we will see more bad news to come. I know the government is talking about Article 23. I think the few remaining independent media outlets, particularly online, it's only a matter of time for them. I don't know if we will see a complete ban on the internet or a complete introduction of the Great Firewall, but I think we may see more censorship, perhaps in a case-by-case basis. So people who post things on social media that may be used against them in prosecution. Well, it already has been, and I think we'll see more of that sort of thing. And we may see certain sites taken down. I've gone almost overnight from a time before the 1st of July last year, where I was in more or less daily contact with many people in Hong Kong, to a situation now where most of my contacts are either in prison, in exile, or are obviously keeping quiet, and I don't want to endanger them by contacting them. I don't say that Hong Kong will never be free. I think if I thought that, I wouldn't do the work I do now. But it's I think we have to be prepared for some more dark days to come before things change. Of course, I would much rather people felt able to stay in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is their home. I don't think anyone who has left wanted to leave. But I think in the circumstances, I'm very glad that the UK has provided this lifeline, and I think the British public is very positive about the BNO scheme, and Hong Kongers will contribute a lot to the UK. I think that so far they have not provided the right kind of assistance to young Hong Kongers who were born after 1997, who are probably the most vulnerable people in most need of help, because young people are disproportionately a large number of those who were arrested and charged from the protests. And what we want the government to do is to say young people who have one BNO parent can come independently of their parents, and that would be so much better than the asylum scheme. It would make no difference to the numbers that the government has factored in, but it would make a big difference to the lives of those young Hong Kongers.
However, the scheme, the new amendment has not been adopted by the UK government. What is the next action?
So the next stages are firstly a conversation, a continued conversation with the government to try to persuade them to make some further concessions and do something that would address the needs that we're highlighting. At the same time, we also intend to work with members of the House of Lords to table the amendment in the House of Lords. The amendment may be slightly refined, but it would still do the same thing. And if we can get it through the House of Lords, it would then come back to the House of Commons, and we'd have another chance there. So it's not over yet. I hope we can build on the sympathy and understanding and find a way that is mutually acceptable to the government and to us and to Hong Kongers to help young Hong Kongers.
Hong Kongers have now the opportunities to come to the UK to restart a new life. However, do you think Hong Kongers really get the real freedom, or they're still facing some kind of threat by the Chinese gangs, of even the CCP? So you can see the exodus in Chinatown weeks ago.
Yes, the incident in Chinatown was very concerning, and I'm also aware that there have been specific threats made to Nathan Law and Simon Cheng on, I think, WeChat or Weibo. And those threats should be taken seriously. The police should take action, and we should ensure that the security of all Hong Kongers, and especially prominent activists like Nathan and Simon, is assured. I think generally speaking, Hong Kongers coming to the UK do feel free, certainly freer than in Hong Kong, but we need to make sure that they feel safe, and that the infiltration of the CCP or pro-CCP gangs is not allowed to intimidate or threaten people who deserve freedom and security here. I was very pleased when the new head of MI6 gave a public speech recently, and he highlighted this as one of the biggest security issues that our intelligence services are concerned about. What we should be doing is doing more background checks, for example, to say that Chinese people are welcome here, but those who have clear affiliations with or influenced by the CCP, we should look very carefully at and make sure that anyone who threatens our freedoms is not welcome here. I have received myself threatening letters sent to my home address. Some were sent to my neighbours, some even sent to my mother. I didn't want to allow myself to be intimidated by those letters, because I think the purpose of the letters was clearly to try to intimidate me, and I didn't want to be afraid. But I did take the precaution of reporting every time I received a letter to the police and to the government as well, so that they are aware. And I think Hong Kongers should do the same if they experience anything that is strange, unusual or threatening. The one thing Hong Kongers should not do is be afraid of speaking out whilst they're in the UK, because the whole reason they've come to the UK is to have the freedom to speak out that they don't have in Hong Kong.
You've written a few words to Hong Kongers. What is it about?
So what I've said here is Hong Kongers keep fighting, and then because Christmas and New Year is coming up, I wish Hong Kongers a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Do you have any other words to Hong Kong people in Hong Kong?
Yes, I think my message to Hong Kong people in Hong Kong is many people are with you and are speaking out for you and are working hard to try to change the situation. I can't promise that we will succeed in changing the situation in the near term, but we recognise that this is a long struggle and we will be with you the whole way. And I know that inside Hong Kong itself it's now almost impossible, extremely dangerous to speak out, to protest, to do anything to criticise the government, and so I would encourage people to stay safe, to take care, but to know that many people outside Hong Kong are doing for you what you are no longer able to do in Hong Kong itself, and that is to speak out and to protest and to keep fighting. And those in Hong Kong who are able to find creative, subtle ways to continue to dissent, then I admire you and support you, but I would say take care and be careful. The other thing I would say is I know that the Legislative Council so-called elections, I call them selections, are coming up on the 19th of December. It's not for me to tell Hong Kongers what they should or shouldn't do. It's for Hong Kongers to decide. But my own personal view is that these elections have no credibility at all and therefore should not be given any legitimacy. Some people have advocated spoiling your ballot paper as a way of protesting, but I know that could be very dangerous. It could even be a crime under the national security law. So I would encourage people to consider whether they might just watch a movie on the 19th of December instead of going out to vote, which might be a safer way of not giving these selections any credibility.
Two characters that they might be very important to you. The first one is Jimmy Lai. You wrote articles for Apple Daily before the national security law, and you had a live show with him. Could you describe him, and do you think Jimmy Lai is one of the symbols of Hong Kong?
I think he's definitely one of the symbols of Hong Kong, and he's a real hero for freedom, not only for Hong Kong but for the world, I think. And he's a wonderful man. I've had the privilege of meeting him a number of times. He's remarkably down to earth. You know, he's someone who is a very wealthy man, has had a very successful business career, is very well known, but he doesn't have any of the kind of pride or superiority that some people in that position would have. Above all, he has both a very strong faith and also a very strong commitment to the values of freedom and democracy and human rights, and that's incredibly inspiring.
The Lord Patton of Barnes, he's the last governor of Hong Kong, and now he's one of the patron of Hong Kong Watch. How do you find him, and can you share your experience with him?
Yes, he's also an inspiration to me. I think that what he tried to do in his few years as the last governor to establish some element of democracy and freedom for Hong Kong was very inspiring in that he really tried to do the right thing. Of course, it should have been done much earlier for Hong Kong, but he did his best. He's deeply committed to Hong Kong and to the values that we share of a belief in liberal democracy, freedom, human rights. In 2017, when I was planning to make a visit to Hong Kong, and a couple of days before I visited, I had received information that unfortunately the Chinese authorities had found out that I was planning to visit and were kind of threatening me not to come. And I asked him if I could talk to him about this to get his advice on what I should do. And we had a brief phone call, and he basically said to me his view was that the Chinese government were trying to threaten me and intimidate me, but that actually, most likely, if I arrived in Hong Kong, I would still be able to get in because Hong Kong still had some autonomy and the decision would be made by Hong Kong immigration. And he said, you shouldn't give in to Chinese CCP intimidation. You should go ahead and you should be fine. And I agreed with him, and so I went. Unfortunately, it turned out that Beijing was more serious than he or anyone else expected, and I was denied entry to Hong Kong. But as soon as I came back to London, we spoke on the phone, I think the same day that I arrived. We arranged to meet a few days later, and he was very concerned by what had happened. And since then, he's been very supportive of Hong Kong Watch since we founded Hong Kong Watch, and we work together very closely, and he's a great champion for Hong Kong.